In John chapter 9, we are introduced to a man who we're told was born blind. He's clearly either a teenager or an adult by now because his parents say he's of age, so he has to be at least 13 or older, probably much older. I don't think they would have their 13-year-old son begging. So here's a man, we don't know his age, in adulthood. Since the day he was born, never saw anything. Complete and utter darkness. He never saw his dad smile. He never saw his mother's face. He never saw his friends that he probably played with as a child. He never saw the sun rise. He never saw the sun set. He never saw a thing. He was born in complete and utter darkness. And Jesus appears to him, makes an ointment out of mud and saliva, pastes it over his eyes, tells him to go wash in the pool. And as he washes with the water and pulls the mud off of his eyes, for the first time in his entire life, he can see. He can see the dazzling colors of God's creation. He can see the faces of those who are astounded and amazed. He can see the very road that he's walking on to go back to his neighborhood. He can see, he can see, he can see. An incredible miracle, Jesus opens the eyes of a man who is physically blind. And at the surface of this story, it's pretty self-evident what it's about. Jesus is powerful. Jesus is from God. Jesus can heal the blind. And by the way, the prophets, as we read in Isaiah, say that's what the Messiah will do. That's what the one from God will do. He'll make the lame walk. He'll open the eyes of the blind, open the ears of the deaf. But in John chapter 9, in addition to the historical reality, which is this miracle, it also plays out like a parable of sorts that teaches a metaphor about another type of blindness that is even deeper than a physical blindness. It's a spiritual blindness that Jesus puts his finger on in verse 39. He said, for judgment, look again, for judgment I came into this world that those who do not see, like this blind man, may see. And listen to this, and those who see may become blind. And that's where we see the Pharisees near him heard these things and said, are we also blind? And essentially Jesus says, yes. Yes, and you're even more guilty because you think that you aren't. Spiritual blindness. The Pharisees are presented in this passage as those who are confident in their own opinions and their own assertions. Look at verse 16, for example. They're asking, and they say, some of the Pharisees said, this man is not from God. They think that they see clearly. Look at verse 24. When they say, give glory to God, they're confronting and interrogating the man that was healed. He says, we know that this man is a sinner. We know reality. We see clearly. Verse 29, we know that God has spoken to Moses, but this man we do not know. We know that Jesus is not from God. We know. These are the things we know. We're confident. And Jesus says, you don't know anything. And you think you do, and that's what makes it all the worse. And it raises an interesting question for all of us this morning. What if we're spiritually blind? How do you know if you're spiritually blind? And what does spiritual blindness look like? Because it comes in different shapes, different permutations. There's different symptoms of spiritual blindness put on display throughout this whole chapter that show us the different forms that spiritual blindness takes. So this morning, what we're going to discover from John chapter 9 is four symptoms of spiritual blindness, and then discover the ultimate cure to spiritual blindness as well. So let's look at four symptoms of spiritual blindness. The first symptom of being spiritually blind is spiritual confusion. So if you're taking notes, the first of the four is spiritual confusion. This comes out of verses 8 through 12. And this is represented by the neighbors of the man who was born blind. You'll notice that again, verse 8 says, those who had seen him before as a beggar were saying, isn't this the man who used to sit and beg? Some said, it is he. Others said, no, but it's like him. But listen to this. The man's there that was healed. He kept saying, I am the man. Like he's saying, it's me. And they're like, is it really him? And he's like, it's me right here. And they're like, we're just not so sure about this. And instead of going to Jesus, after he says, the one who, they said, look at this, verse 11, he said, the man called Jesus made mud, that's how I'm healed. They don't go to Jesus. Who do they go to? They go to the religious authorities and say, we're confused. Help sort this out for us. All the while it's plain as day that Jesus has just healed them, they're confused. Now, I think this is all the more perplexing when you realize that this man is at least 12, probably 20 or 30. They have looked at this man every day of their lives, right? They're his neighbors. He's the one that they're always giving the money to, and they're still confused. They don't see clearly. Even when he's saying as plain as day what has happened, they're perplexed. And it raises some interesting questions because sometimes people believe that the reason that they don't believe in Jesus is because they don't have enough evidence. If I just had enough evidence, then I would quickly believe that this is reality and adjust my lifestyle to fit that. But passages like this reveal to us that our spiritual confusion isn't based on our ability to have evidence or lack of evidence. They had all the evidence they need, including the man who was healed that they saw every day of their life, saying, it is me, this is how it happened, Jesus did it. And they were scratching their heads saying, it's not clear. Not a case closed. We're not sure. We got to do some more research here. It gets at the heart of the problem of the human heart, which is this. We don't just objectively evaluate evidence and go where it leads. Something about our heart actually weighs the evidence in ways that goes away from belief, away from trust, away from God. Romans 1 says it this way, that all the evidence we need in creation declares who God is, His power, His glory, and we literally suppress it. Part of our sin is to overlook the evidence and build our own interpretation of reality despite the evidence. 2 Corinthians chapter 4, Paul says it this way. He says, we preach the gospel clearly. It's not veiled at all. There's no hidden agenda here. But this is what he said. And last week, we talked about the power of the devil, right? This is what he said. The devil, Satan, has literally blinded the hearts and the minds of unbelievers. He uses that word, he blinds them so they won't see the glory of the gospel of Jesus Christ. That we are born into this world with blinders on, and it creates all kinds of spiritual confusion, not because there's not enough evidence that God made you, or that Jesus is powerful, this man that walked 2,000 years ago and did all these things that are recorded, historically accurate, all the locations, everything is there. The evidence you need is right there. But confusion despite the evidence. The first symptom of spiritual blindness is when you are confronted with the reality of who Jesus is and what He's done, and despite the evidence, you're still confused and suppress it. That's the first symptom of spiritual blindness. The second symptom is spiritual hostility. Spiritual hostility. And this is verses 13 through 17 and 24 through 34. So you remember, they're confused. They don't go to Jesus. They go to the authorities, and the authorities represented by the Pharisees. Verse 13, they brought to the Pharisees the man who'd been formerly blind to interrogate him. And we already looked at some of their confident assertions. We know that this man is not from God. He's a sinner, verse 24. God has not spoken to him, verse 29. These guys aren't just confused, they are confident. They are 100% confident that Jesus is not from God, that He is a sinner, that He's not somebody to be trusted. They're confident that they see and that everybody else is blind. You know, in Romans 2, verse 19, Paul talks about, chapter 2, he says, the gospel's for everyone, Jew and Gentile. And then he starts to talk about how the Jews, and particularly the religious leaders, saw themselves. He said, if you're so confident, if you're so sure that you're a guide to the blind, that they really thought, as the nation of Israel, that they were to lead the nations out of darkness into the light, which was them, right? That they were the ones that were going to be the guides to everybody else who are so far off. And yet Jesus, time and time again, declares their blindness. You don't need to turn there, but Matthew chapter 23, if you want to read that at another time, it has some pretty strong pronouncements against the religious leaders, particularly the Pharisees. They're called the 8 woes. Jesus just declares woe after woe after woe. These are the spots where he says, like, your whitewashed tombs, you look all good on the outside, full of death and decay on the inside. You wash the outside of the cup, but the inside's all dirty. So, woe, 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 8 times. And out of those 8 woes, 5 declare woes for their blindness. Woe to you. He calls them in chapter 15 of Matthew, blind guides. And he gives us this parable. You probably have heard it before, even if you're not a Christian. If the blind lead the blind, they'll both fall into a ditch. Have you ever heard that? That's from Jesus talking about these. That you think that you're guiding people, that you see the way clearly, and you're calling everybody else out saying they're wrong and you're right. All the while you're blind, both going to fall into a ditch. Doesn't, by the way, in any way minimize their confidence in their own assessment, does it? Right? They are 100% sure that they are right. And this is another problem with humanity. Not only do we have confusion because of sin, we actually confidently dig our heels in blindness, thinking that we see all the while when we are 100% wrong. 100% wrong. And by the way, nobody illustrates this greater than the Pharisee who wrote much of your New Testament, the Bible, Paul, right? Do you remember this man? He was Saul, the first Christian martyr, Stephen. They stoned this guy and brought their garments and laid it down at the feet of Saul, who was a Pharisee. Saul literally made it his job to go from city to city, find out if you were a Christian, lock you up, drag you back to Jerusalem so that you could be tried there and found guilty. His whole job was basically to squash out the Jesus movement, to squash out the way. And you know the story. But if you don't, I'll share it briefly again. On the road to Damascus, he's confronted by Jesus in heaven. Jesus rose from the dead. He's in heaven now. And Jesus blinds him. Do you remember that? Big glaring light. And all of a sudden he says, "Who are you, Lord?" He says, "I'm Jesus whom you're persecuting." At that moment, you have to have one of those gulp moments like, oh, shoot. I was on the wrong team. I was like 100% on the wrong team. I was so confident, so zealous for God, and I was opposing God. And again, what Jesus does when the light hits him, he actually physically blinds Saul for a moment, for a day or two. Not to leave him blind, but so that when Ananias prays for him and the scales fall off of his eyes, the scales fall off of his heart as well. And for the first time, when he was blinded, he finally saw correctly. And all of us who are Christians can testify to the power of God, and sometimes the grace of God has to blind you first so you can finally see. The beloved hymn, Amazing Grace, says this: "'Twas grace that taught my heart to fear, and grace my fears relieved." That grace actually comes and puts the fear of God, and grace confronts you, confronts your assessment of yourself and what you thought was real, so that your eyes can finally spiritually be opened. And you don't have to be religious, by the way, to have this spiritual hostility. This is just an example of what happens in the human race, where we get so dug into our perspective, we think we're 100% right, and we're 100% wrong. A symptom of spiritual blindness is spiritual hostility towards Jesus, towards Christ. Thirdly, a third symptom, a third outworking of spiritual blindness is what I would call spiritual neutrality. Spiritual neutrality. This is represented by the blind man's parents. You remember them? They come in, they're questioned, and they do everything they can to evade the questioners, right? "Is this your son? You say he was born blind. How does he now see?" Verse 19. "Well, we know it's our son. We know he was born blind. We don't know how he sees. Give me a break." you know exactly how he sees. You know he's your son. You know he's born blind. And you know he ran quickly to mom and dad, said, Mom, Dad, I can see again. Jesus healed me. John shows their hand. Verse 22, his parents said these things because they feared the Jews, because they already agreed that they'd be put out of the synagogue. That's why they said he's of age, ask him. They're basically saying, go talk to our son. We have no backbone, and we're going to throw our son under the bus rather than take a stand for Jesus and defend our own offspring, right? They're just playing it neutral, not going to rock the boat, just want to stay loved by everybody, accepted by everybody. If I just play it safe, just tell the bare minimum facts, and then back away and push it back on our son. Spiritual neutrality. Why? Why wouldn't they stand up for their son? Why wouldn't they stand up for Jesus? He just healed one of their most beloved. It's their child. He healed their child, and they won't stand up for Jesus. Why? Fear. Fear, fear, fear. His parents said these things because they feared the Jews. They feared being put out of the synagogue. They feared being ostracized. They feared being rejected by the community that they respected and loved the most. They feared that they would be isolated and pushed out. And they want to be at the center of the pack. They want to be accepted and loved. They want to know that they belong to this community, and they'll do anything to protect it, even distance themselves from the Savior of the world. Fear. Fear will keep you blind. Fear will keep you from standing up for what's right. Fear will keep you from standing up for Jesus. It's fear, and it keeps you spiritually neutral, and it keeps you spiritually blind. And by the way, this is not just built into this passage. This is built into the whole Bible and all of John's gospel. Jesus knows what's in us. Flip over to chapter 12, just as an example. Chapter 12, verse 37. You ready? Chapter 12, 37. This is after Jesus raised Lazarus from the dead. Look at the unbelief of the people, is the header put into my Bible. Verse 37, so after all 7 signs, though he, see that? Chapter 12, 37, though he, Jesus, had done so many signs before them, they still did not believe in him, so that the word spoken by the prophet Isaiah might be fulfilled. Lord, who has believed what he's heard from us? To whom has the arm of the Lord been revealed? Verse 39, therefore they could not believe. Why couldn't they not believe? For again Isaiah said, he has blinded their eyes and hardened their hearts, lest they see with their eyes and understand with their hearts and turn, and I would heal them. And Isaiah said these things because he saw his glory. He saw the glory of Christ and spoke of him. Nevertheless, many of the authorities, listen to this, believed in him. The authorities believed in Jesus. But for fear of the Pharisees, they did not confess it. Fear. So that they would not be put out of the synagogue. Fear. What is driving this fear? What is underneath this fear? Why are they so afraid? Verse 43, for they love the glory that comes from man more than the glory that comes from God. At the heart of our fear is a craving, is a want, is a love masquerading. And it's a love for what people think about you. And you love that more than you love God. And you'll never stand up for Christ. And you'll never see, and you'll never believe, and you'll never put yourself into a position of vulnerability until you love God more than people. And you won't be able to love people either, by the way, until you love God the most. Because you'll always be a people pleaser. You'll always be just trying to take temperature so you could read back to them what they want to hear. That's not the right way to love people. The right way to love people is to tell them the truth lovingly, carefully, sensitively, but to love God first. To love him first, no matter the cost. Spiritual neutrality keeps us blind. Fear will keep you blind, but if you love the glory of God more, the blinders will come off. And the fourth and final symptom of spiritual blindness is spiritual helplessness. Spiritual helplessness. This is represented by the man born blind. And by the way, he is the one held up to us as the one that we want to be like, isn't he? Here's a man born blind from birth. Historically true, physically true, but also a metaphor of sorts, because we are all born into this world with a spiritual blindness, both through the God of this age who's blinded us and our sin that suppresses the truth. We willfully are blinded. We willfully keep our eyes shut, our hearts closed. There's a spiritual blindness that we come into this, we're born into this world with. And yet God wants to perform a great reversal. Verse 39, because again he said that those who do not see may see, is the reason that he came into this world. And this spiritually helpless man, we see in him an ignorance that's quite humble, actually. He's a man that doesn't state that he knows more than he does. In fact, he's evidently saying, I don't know how this happened. Verse 12, they say, where is he? He says, I don't know where he is. Verse 25, they say, we know this man is a sinner. Verse 25, he says, I don't know if he's a sinner. I don't know. One thing I do know is I was blind, and now I see. Even when Jesus comes to him, he says, do you believe in the Son of Man? Verse 36, he says, who is he, sir? He's just a man he's helpless. He doesn't know. But here's the thing. He knows that he doesn't know. And that's the place to begin. He knows that he doesn't know. And Jesus takes his physical blindness and his spiritual blindness and opens both of his eyes so that he can see his glory. You know, he healed his physical eyes in a moment at the washing of the pool of Siloam. You know, he washed them and instantly he could see. But also throughout this story, you see that his spiritual eyes, it's not an instantaneous moment for him. It's actually like a gradual conversion, if you will, a gradual opening of his eyes to the very end. So that, for example, initially he thinks that he says, verse 10, then how were your eyes opened? He said, the man called Jesus made mud and my eyes were opened. So he calls Jesus the man. Then in verse 17, they say, what do you say about him? He says, I think he's a prophet. And then verse 27, he challenges them, do you also want to become his disciples? Now he says, this is a man worth following. He's a man, he's a prophet, he's worth following. Verse 33, he goes about, he says, this man is from God. If this man were not from God, he couldn't have done this. So now he says, not only is he a prophet, not only is he a man worth following, he's a man from God. And when Jesus finally confronts him, comes to him, introduces himself in verse 35, by the way, remember, he's never seen Jesus with his physical eyes. So when Jesus walks up to him, until he hears his voice, he doesn't even recognize Jesus. But he says, do you believe in the Son of Man? That's a title for the Messiah, the one sent from God to judge the nations. He said to him, who is he, sir, that I may believe in him? And Jesus said to him, you have seen him, and it is he who is speaking to you. And then at that moment, faith comes into his heart, saving faith. He moves from the uncertain to the certain, from the gradual to bright as day can see. And he says, Lord, I believe. And he falls down and he worships Jesus as the Son of Man and as the Lord of all creation. He worships Jesus rightly because Jesus opened both his physical eyes, but also his spiritual eyes to who he is. And wherever you are on your spiritual journey, I pray to God that today, Jesus just, boom, I believe. I thought he was a man, now I think he's God, and I got it. But sometimes Jesus is at work in your life where it's a process. There's another story, it's actually perplexing, it's in Mark's gospel, Mark 8. And Jesus spits on the guy's eyes, and he takes his hands off. He says, "What do you see?" And he says, "I see, it looks like trees walking." Which I don't know how he knew what trees looked like if he was blind, but they look like trees walking. And Jesus says, "Okay." And he does it again, and he sees clearly. Sometimes Jesus says, "Open," and you see clearly. Sometimes it's still a little fuzzy. But here's my point here. Jesus is committed to opening your eyes. If you see trees walking, you're in the right place. Keep coming. Keep listening. Keep studying. You can be like this man and say, "I don't know. I don't have it all figured out yet, and not 100% sure yet, but I'm looking. I'm looking for Jesus to give me the clarity, to give me the faith, to give me the truth of who He is so that my faith is real." So what is the cure for spiritual blindness? It's Jesus. The one that said, "Go to the pool," called sent. Siloam means sent. Is the sent one of God. And He comes into your life like Bartimaeus. Says, "Lord, have mercy on me." He was blind, a man blind. Jesus said to him, "What do you want me to do?" He says, "I want to see." And Jesus gives him sight. And He does that to all who call on His name. If you know that you're blind, if you know you want to see, call out to Him for mercy, and He will give you sight now and forever.